For 5 years, Ilara's silence had been a thing of substance, a heavy cloak she wore against the biting wind and the hollow ache in her chest. It was the same silence that had settled over the small grave on the hill behind her homestead, the one marked by a single, smooth river stone. Grief had scoured her clean of unnecessary words, leaving only the grim efficiency of survival. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of her land, the rhythmic creak of her wagon wheels on the supply road, and the vast, indifferent sky. It was on this road, a ribbon of pale dust cutting through an ocean of sun-scorched grass, that the world showed its own particular brand of silence, the silence of indifference. Wagon after wagon, laden with goods or families seeking fortune in the west, had passed them by. They were a pair of smudges against the unforgiving landscape, two small girls huddled together at the edge of the road, their forms so frail they seemed little more than heat shimmer and desperation. Men looked, then looked away, urging their horses on. Women pulled their own children closer, their faces hardening into masks of grim necessity. They were a problem someone else would have to solve. A tragedy waiting to happen, but not on their watch. Ilara saw them from a quarter-mile out. Her old horse, Job, plodded forward with the same steady, melancholic gait as always. The sun beat down, turning the brass fittings on the harness to blinding points of light. She saw the way the smaller girl's head rested on the older one's lap, a gesture of absolute trust in a world that had offered them none. The older girl, who couldn't have been more than 9, stared back at the approaching wagon, her gaze not pleading but defiant, a tiny, cornered animal ready to fight a bear. Ilara's hands, calloused and capable, tightened on the reins. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, surfaced, a small hand in hers, a child's laughter that used to fill the now empty cabin. It was a sound she hadn't allowed herself to remember for a very long time. Her heart, a dormant, petrified thing, gave a painful lurch. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and loss, screamed at her to keep going. They were not her burden. The world was full of sorrows, and she was in no position to carry anyone else's. Job continued his steady walk, the wagon drawing level with the children. Ilara looked straight ahead, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the horizon that promised only more of the same. But she could feel their stare. She could feel the heat radiating off their small, starving bodies. The dust settled on their matted hair. The world held its breath. The wagon creaked past them. 10 feet. 20. 30. Ilara pulled back hard on the reins. Job stopped, his ears twitching in surprise. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the buzzing of a fly and the ragged, shocked breath of the older girl. Without a word, Ilara wrapped the leather reins around the brake handle and began the slow, deliberate process of stepping off her wagon. Her boots met the dust with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to echo across the entire plain. She had made a choice. The silence was broken. Ilara moved with the economy of someone who never wasted emotion. She walked to the back of the wagon, her shadow falling over the 2 children. They flinched, the older girl pulling the younger one tighter, shielding her with a bony arm. Fear was a stench on them, stronger than the dust and sweat. It was the feral, hopeless fear of the hunted. Ilara's face remained a stoic mask, betraying nothing of the turmoil that had forced her to stop. She unhooked the water cask from the side of the wagon, the sloshing sound liquid and loud in the stark quiet. She filled a tin cup and set it on the ground, a few feet from them. She did not approach closer. She backed away and stood by the wagon wheel, waiting. The sun was relentless. The older girl's eyes darted from the cup to Ilara, then back again. Suspicion warred with a desperate, consuming thirst. Her own lips were cracked and bleeding. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, with a tremor that shook her entire frame, the girl crawled forward. She snatched the cup, her movements jerky, and held it to her sister's lips first. The little one drank greedily, spilling drops that vanished instantly into the thirsty dirt. Only when her sister had finished did the older girl drink, her throat working convulsively. Ilara turned back to the wagon and retrieved a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were 2 pieces of hardtack and a strip of dried jerky. She set this down where the cup had been. More waiting. This time, the hesitation was shorter. The food disappeared with a ferocity that spoke of days, or weeks, of gnawing hunger. The entire exchange happened in complete silence. No please, no thanks. There was only need and the meeting of that need. When the last crumb was gone, the older girl looked at Ilara, her dark eyes unreadable. Ilara simply gestured with her head toward the open back of the wagon. It was not a command, but an offer. A sanctuary on wheels. The girl seemed to weigh the silent woman and the empty road, one a mystery, the other a certainty of death. She made her decision. She helped her little sister, who was weak and barely able to stand, and half carried, half dragged her to the wagon. Ilara gave them no help, letting the girl prove her own strength, her own commitment to the choice. She watched as they clambered inside, settling into a dark corner behind a stack of supply sacks, two small owls in a dusty barn. Ilara climbed back into her seat, unwrapped the reins, and with a soft click of her tongue, set Job in motion. The wagon creaked forward, leaving that spot on the road behind. The silence inside the wagon was different now. It was no longer the singular, monolithic silence of her own grief. It was a shared space, fragile and uncertain, populated by the shallow breaths of two traumatized children. The journey to her homestead took the rest of the day. As dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, the outline of her small, sturdy cabin appeared against the darkening hills. It was a fortress of solitude, built to keep the world out. Now, she was willingly bringing the world in. The cabin was just as she had left it, stark, clean, and steeped in memory. A single bed, a rough-hewn table, two chairs. A stone fireplace, cold and dark. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke, the ghosts of a life that was. The girls, whose names she would later learn were Lyra and Kaylin, slid from the wagon and stood uncertainly, clutching each other as they took in the isolated dwelling. Kaylin, the younger one, hid her face in her sister's tattered dress. Lyra's gaze swept the horizon, noting the lack of other homes, the vast emptiness that surrounded them. She was assessing threats, even here. Ilara ignored them for a moment, moving with purpose to unhitch Job and lead him to the small corral, giving him water and feed. The routine was an anchor in the sudden strangeness of her life. Only when her duties were done did she turn to the girls. She motioned them inside. That night, she made a thin stew of salted pork and dried beans. She built a fire in the hearth, and as the flames caught, the warm light pushed back the gloom, making the small space feel less like a tomb and more like a shelter. It was the first time she had cooked for more than one person since the fever took her husband and son in the same cruel winter. The girls ate ravenously, huddled together at the table, their eyes following Ilara's every move. When they were finished, she pointed to the single bed. Her bed. Without question, they crawled onto it, disappearing under the heavy quilt. Ilara took a spare blanket and settled into one of the chairs by the fire, the chair her husband had always favored. Sleep did not come easily. The cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the occasional whimper from Kaylin's dreams. Each sound was a stone dropped into the placid, stagnant pool of Ilara's existence. In the days that followed, a fragile routine was forged. Ilara taught them not with words, but with actions. She showed Lyra how to work the water pump, how to mend a tear in a shirt with small, neat stitches. She showed Kaylin which plants were for eating and which were for poison. The girls were quick learners, their senses sharpened by hardship. Lyra remained watchful, her silence a mirror of Ilara's own, but her hands were always busy, always seeking a task. Kaylin began to heal. A bit of color returned to her cheeks. One afternoon, while watching Ilara knead dough, she spoke her first word. "Bread," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Ilara paused, her knuckles deep in the floury mass. She looked at the child, and for the first time in years, the corner of her mouth twitched, a faint, ghostly impression of a smile. It was a beginning. But the plains were a place of harsh truths, and peace was a fleeting currency. One morning, her old dog, Bones, who rarely stirred from his spot by the door, lifted his head and let out a low growl. Ilara followed his gaze. On the distant ridge, a speck appeared. a rider, moving at a steady, purposeful pace toward her homestead. A knot of ice formed in Ilara's stomach. Lyra, who had been scrubbing a pot by the door, saw it too. The rag fell from her hand. All the color drained from her face, replaced by a stark, primal terror. She grabbed Kaylin, pulling her behind her skirts as the rider grew steadily larger, no longer a speck, but a man. A shadow on the horizon, coming for them. The man rode a fine black horse, a stark contrast to Ilara's own weathered mare. He carried himself with an air of unearned authority, his clothes dark and well-made, but coated in the same dust that covered everyone else. He stopped a polite distance from the cabin, dismounting with a fluid motion. He was smiling, but it was a smile that did not touch his cold, assessing eyes. He looked from Ilara, who had moved to stand in the doorway, to the two girls half hidden behind her. Lyra was trembling, a low, guttural sound of fear caught in her throat. "A good morning to you," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Name Silas." "I seem to have lost something." Ilara said nothing. Her posture was granite, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She was a wall of silent opposition. Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was not used to being met with such unblinking stillness. "Two girls," he continued, gesturing with his riding crop toward the cabin. "Indentured to me. Their father owed a debt. They ran off a few days back. Ungrateful little things." His gaze fell on Lyra, and a cruel possessiveness flickered within it. "Caused a whole lot of troubles, their children." Ilara's voice was low, rusty from disuse, but it carried the weight of conviction. It was the most she had said at one time in 5 years. Silas chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "They are property, Same as my horse. And I've come to collect what's mine." He took a step forward. Bones, the old dog, let out a more serious growl, the fur bristling along his spine. Silas's eyes narrowed, and he rested a hand on the pistol holstered at his hip. "I don't want any trouble. I'm a reasonable man. I'll be on my way, and you can have your quiet life back. Just send them out." Ilara did not move. She felt Lyra's small hand clutch the back of her dress. It was a desperate, anchoring grip. In that moment, the 5 years of hollow grief and the fresh, fragile shoots of purpose converged. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a certainty. "No," she said. The word was absolute. It hung in the air between them, as solid and immovable as the landscape itself. Silas stared at her, his mask of civility finally slipping away to reveal the raw entitlement beneath. He saw not a grieving widow, but an obstacle. "That's a poor decision," he said softly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A very poor decision. I have business in town. I'll be back for them tomorrow. At dusk. I suggest you have them ready." He didn't wait for a reply. He swung himself back onto his horse, shot one last, venomous look at the cabin door, and wheeled the animal around. He rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating pall of dread. The silence he left behind was nothing like the peace they had begun to build. It was the taut, humming silence of a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Lyra finally broke her own long silence. Her story came out in jagged, whispered pieces, a narrative of hunger, cruelty, and the man named Silas who saw them not as children, but as chattel to be worked until they broke. Ilara listened, her expression unchanging, but inside, something shifted. The last embers of her old, passive grief were extinguished, consumed by the clean, cold fire of protective rage. After the girls were asleep, she walked to the old sea chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the heavy lid. Beneath her husband's folded shirts and a small, carved wooden bird her son had made lay his rifle, wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands were steady as she lifted it. The steel was cold and heavy. A promise. She spent the rest of the night cleaning it by the light of the fire, the rhythmic, metallic scrape of the cleaning rod the only sound in the waiting darkness. The day of Silas's promised return dawned grey and oppressive. The sky was a lid of bruised pewter, the air thick and still. A storm was coming. Ilara could feel it in her bones, the same way she could feel the approach of violence. She worked all day with a grim, focused energy. She barred the back window, reinforced the latch on the front door, and brought extra buckets of water in from the pump. She was turning her home, their sanctuary, into a fort. Lyra watched her, her young face old with understanding. She did not cry. She simply kept Kaylin close, speaking to her in low, soothing tones, a small mother hen guarding her single chick. They were a silent, determined trio, bound by a common threat. Elara gave Lyra a single, clear instruction. If something happened, she was to take Kaylin, run out the back, and not stop until she reached the creek bed. She was not to look back. As dusk began to bleed across the grey sky, Elara took her position. She extinguished the main lamp, leaving only the faint, flickering glow of the fire. It would make her a harder target. She sat in the chair her husband used to occupy, the one that faced the door, the heavy rifle resting across her lap. The waiting was the hardest part. The wind began to pick up, whistling a mournful tune around the eaves of the cabin. Bones whined softly by the door, his ears flat against his head. Then he went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. They were here. Two figures emerged from the gloom on horseback, materializing like wraiths. Silas, and another man, broader and more menacing. They didn't bother with pleasantries this time. They dismounted and strode toward the door, their boots crunching on the dry ground with an arrogant finality. Elara! Silas's voice was a sharp bark against the wind. Last chance. Send them out. The cabin remained dark and silent. He swore under his breath and motioned to the other man. Together, they slammed their shoulders against the door. The wood groaned, the reinforced latch holding firm. They hit it again. A crack appeared. Lyra stifled a sob, her arms wrapped around Kaylin. Elara rose from her chair, the rifle now held tight against her shoulder, its cold stock a familiar comfort. She was no longer just a widow. She was a protector. A force of nature equal to the coming storm. With a final, splintering crash, the door burst open. Silas and the other man stumbled into the near darkness, their forms silhouetted against the dying light. For a moment, they were blinded by the gloom. That moment was all Elara needed. They are not yours, she said, her voice clear and steady in the sudden chaos. Silas's head snapped toward the sound. He saw her then, a resolute shadow by the hearth, the long barrel of the rifle glinting in the firelight. His eyes widened in disbelief, his hand reaching for his pistol. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The explosion was deafening inside the small cabin, a single, definitive roar that drowned out the wind. The flash illuminated the room in a ghastly, instantaneous tableau. Silas was thrown backward, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the floor. The other man, stunned, fumbled for his own weapon. Before he could raise it, Elara worked the lever action, the slick, metallic shink-shunker sound of cold competence. She fired again. The second shot was just as final as the first. The man fell across the threshold, half in, half out of the home he had tried to violate. And then, there was silence. A profound, ringing silence broken only by the whimpering of the wind and the terrified, ragged breaths of the two children huddled in the corner. The threat was over. The cost was paid in gunpowder and blood. Elara stood motionless for a long time, the rifle still warm in her hands, its smoke coiling in the firelight like a departing spirit. The storm broke that night, a furious deluge that washed the blood from the threshold and turned the dust to mud. It was a baptism for the land, and for the 3 souls inside the cabin. Elara worked through the rain, dragging the bodies away from the house, her movements methodical, her face unreadable in the flashes of lightning. She did not feel triumph, nor did she feel remorse. She felt only a grim, hollow finality. She had done what was necessary to protect her own. When she returned, soaked and weary, she found Lyra and Kaylin exactly where she had left them, huddled together under the quilt on the bed. They watched her with wide, haunted eyes. Elara did not speak of what had happened. There were no words for it. She simply rebuilt the fire, its steady, defiant glow a testament to the life that continued within those four walls. She sat in her chair, the rifle cleaned and propped against the wall, and kept watch until the grey light of dawn broke through the clouds. The homestead had been defended. The family, forged in fear and violence, had survived its first test. The seasons turned. The harsh memory of that night faded, not into nothingness, but into the bedrock of their shared history. It was the foundation upon which they built their new life. The silence that had once defined Ilara was gradually filled. It was replaced by Kaylin's questions about the names of wildflowers, by Lyra's quiet humming as she learned to cook, by the sounds of shared meals and evening stories read aloud from one of Ilara's few books. The cabin, once a monument to loss, became a home. Its walls absorbed laughter. The small grave on the hill was still there, a place of quiet remembrance, but it was no longer the anchor that held Ilara to her grief. It was a part of her story, not the end of it. She taught the girls to ride, to track, to read the sky for weather. She gave them the skills to be strong, not because the world was kind, but because it was not. She gave them the resilience she had learned in solitude, now repurposed as a gift of love. One brilliant spring afternoon, a year after the riders came, the three of them stood on the porch, looking out at the land. The plains were vibrant and green after the rains, teeming with new life. Kaylin, no longer frail, chased a butterfly near the steps. Lyra stood beside Ilara, her posture relaxed and confident. She was a child again, but with the quiet wisdom of a survivor. Ilara looked at them, at the home they had made, at the vast, open horizon that no longer seemed empty and threatening, but full of promise. The silent widow who had stepped off her wagon was gone. In her place stood a mother, a guardian, her purpose etched not in stone, but in the hopeful faces of the children she had chosen. A passing traveler on the road might have seen them there, a woman and two girls, and thought them a family. And they would have been right.